From abysmal medical care and marching in the mud to being wasted on useless battles by glory-hungry commanders, these disturbing truths will give you a second thought about the Civil War. Up first are changing times. War never changes. Except that's a lie. Change is one of the main things that happens in war, and the Civil War was no different. Obviously, military conflict is never nice and peaceful by definition, but the Civil War would become the bloodiest conflict in American history for a very good reason. During the Napoleonic era, just before the Civil War, armies engaged in linear warfare. Communication is hard, especially on a battlefield filled with booms and smoke, so keeping everyone shoulder to shoulder kept the unit together and cut down on confusion. Keeping everyone together also concentrated the relatively inaccurate fire of muskets into a wall of lead, turning a single inaccurate soldier into a force of devastation. After a brutal volley at 50 yards, the two sides would close to bayonet range. Well, it turns out fighting with bayonets is terrifying, and most of the time the losing side would just surrender or run away before contact was made. But the Civil War was different. Bang-bang sticks were given grooved or rifled barrels, which greatly increased accuracy. Mini balls replaced lead shot and greatly increased range. And paper and brass cartridges replaced flintlock muskets, greatly increasing fire rate. All of a sudden, you couldn't walk to within 100 meters of the enemy, fire a single volley, and charge them off the field. Their new boomsticks more than tripled effective range and could fire double or triple the speed. No more was the decisive bayonet charge, but many officers did not notice this change and continued to use outdated tactics. This is part of the reason for the massive increase in casualties. Next is medical care. We all know that modern medicine is exactly that, modern, and past remedies were often far more brutal and far less effective. But it was even worse in the Civil War. The fact of the matter is, very few soldiers saw anything like the cutting edge of Civil War era medicine. Much of this is down to supply issues, especially for forces like Sherman's raid through the South, where a solid line of supply and communication was almost always impossible. Not only was the best care not available, but the massive supply problems both the Union and Confederacy faced meant that often even simple necessities like bandages were severely lacking. Soldiers could sometimes be left for days without real medical aid because there simply wasn't enough medicine to go around. This is another reason why Civil War doctors got so good at amputations, because often after 3 days of suffering, that was the only available option. Next are trenches. When we hear trenches, we think of the Western Front of World War I or even Eastern Europe today, but people rarely think of the Civil War as having a lot of trenches. But the sieges of Vicksburg and Petersburg were full of them. Trenches are wildly helpful, even today, and as one wise man once said, we'll stop digging trenches when the earth stops being so darn good at stopping lead. But while trenches save lives, they are also horrible quagmires that can sap energy and morale. Waiting around in ankle to knee-deep mud for weeks at a time is a dangerous prospect, and trench foot was a serious issue. Even more so because often amputation was the only remedy. At the Battle of Vicksburg, Confederate soldiers spent over a month in their trenches before the city fell. While initially the trenches were well built, dry, and with good drainage, that all changed with the advent of battle. Shells smashed them to pieces, and the constant fighting turned the dirt to bloody mud. Next is confronting the truth. When the Civil War started, it wasn't about slavery to most of the Union soldiers. For the South, it was always about preserving slavery, but most Union soldiers just didn't care and saw the war more as being about preserving the Union and putting down a rebellion than ending slavery. But that all changed as the fighting continued. As Union soldiers moved into the South farther and farther, they more frequently came across runaway slaves, black freedmen, and refugees fleeing the fighting. For the first time, many of these city folks and immigrants were forced to truly confront the evils of slavery, and it made a profound impact. You can see the shift in memoirs and journals as soldiers begin to realize they're part of something bigger. They're told of stories of atrocities and horror enacted on these former slaves, and even more importantly, they begin to fight alongside black soldiers. Many Union soldiers who entered the war for more selfish reasons of glory and adventure would become lifelong abolitionists after seeing firsthand the horrors of slavery. For many, it even took on the air of a holy war, sacrificing their lives to in some part wipe away the horrible stain of slavery. Corruption devours and destroys armies, and it almost did exactly that to the Union Army early in the war. When war broke out, it was a mad scramble to bring together the industry and funding to equip the new Union Army, and this left the door wide open for grifters and cheats. The situation was so bad that most soldiers in the early years had no shoes, no uniforms, and sometimes even no bang sticks. They were forced to march with cloth-wrapped feet, carrying boomsticks from a century earlier, and dye their own clothes. All the while, the American government was signing obscene contracts for useless boomsticks because they made certain senators and congressmen money. Next are wild hogs. You'd think that after getting wounded, disease would be your biggest threat to survival, and for the most part you'd be right. But for the hundreds of wounded left on the field at Gettysburg overnight, there was something far more terrifying to contend with: wild hogs. Multiple soldiers on both sides recount horrific tales of the hogs coming out at night to feast on the carrion. Except hogs are big creatures that will eat just about anything, and several soldiers spent a terrifying night fighting off feral hogs with their bayonets. More than a few tell of friends and comrades who didn't have the strength to fight off the hogs, and the battlefield filled with the sound of crunching. Next is the casualty count. It's been said that the Civil War was the most destructive war in American history, and that is no exaggeration. During the First World War, America had 109 million people and had 320,000 casualties, with 116,000 of those being deaths. In the Second World War, America had a population of 132 million and had over 1 million casualties, with 400,000 deaths. During the Civil War, the US had a population of just barely 40 million. There were more than 650,000 deaths, along with more than 400,000 wounded. Strictly by the numbers, more Americans were lost in the Civil War than in the Second World War, while the nation had less than half the population. This really helps to put in context just how incredibly brutal this war was. Next is the Mud March. Union General Ambrose Burnside wasn't a great commander. He had ambition, but things never really seemed to pan out. Following his disastrous failure to cross the Rappahannock River in the Battle of Fredericksburg, Burnside was desperate to restore his reputation and the morale of his army. Instead, he would confuse all his officers, earn the ire of Abraham Lincoln, and delay the operation significantly. By the time it did go ahead, much surprise had been lost, and several brutal winter storms set in, leading to significant delays, and eventually the 3-day Mud March. Robert E. Lee would escape the doomed attack, and instead an already battered and disheartened Army of the Potomac would spend 3 days being harassed by snipers and marching through endless wastes of mud. No contact was made with the enemy, and Burnside was replaced immediately afterwards. Next are callous Confederates. It was popular at the time, and even today, to call Ulysses S. Grant the butcher of the Overland Campaign for his massive casualty counts. And to be sure, those casualties were not great, but it was actually the Confederates who consistently threw their soldiers' lives away on a whim. See, Grant understood his strengths, and while he lost a lot of soldiers, he was always winning the broader strategic fight. But the Confederates were obsessed with winning beautiful tactical victories ever since Stonewall Jackson won a stunning tactical victory at Chancellorsville. The issue is, war is more about choosing when to fight than it is about winning any single battle. The Confederates didn't have the population to be able to waste soldiers on meaningless tactical victories, while Grant was always focused on winning the broader strategic fight. America, literally since its inception, has always been a nation of immigrants, and this was no different in the Civil War. Italians, German, and Irish immigrants had been flooding the nation for some time, but despite making up only 13% of the population, immigrants made up 25% of the armed forces. If you include the sons of immigrants, that number jumps to 43%. Add in the 10% of the armed forces that were made up of black men and freed slaves, and the majority of the Union Army wouldn't even be considered American by the racist Northerners. Some have said that this was an intentional effort by the government to cull immigrants or restrict the amount of Anglo-Saxons that went to war, but it's more likely that it's because new immigrants are often fervently patriotic. On one hand, this is how we ended up with Zouaves and other international brigades that brought the fighting culture from their own nations to America, but it also greatly helped in cementing Irish, Italian, and German immigrants as valuable and valued parts of the Union. Sadly, the same kindness was not extended to black soldiers, and American civil rights would need to be continuously fought for the next 200 years. Those were 10 disturbing truths about the life of a Civil War soldier. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you next time.